This is Walter Sapotachny with the 28th Division Association Oral History Program. And I'm here today with Bill Tritt. Bill, thank you so much for your willingness to take the time to come in and talk with us a little bit about what you did during the military. We greatly appreciate it.
Good to be here.
All right. Well, let's get started, okay? So, where were you born?
I was born in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania.
Okay. And what were your parents or siblings feeling about you joining the service?
Well, I didn't join, I was drafted. And it was during Vietnam. And my father was 4F during World War II, which I think he tried to get in every military service you could possibly join. And he could do most of everything, but he had one disqualifying health problem, which I wasn't even aware of, and so he went to work for the federal government, and we didn't really have, my grandfather was drafted in World War I, but he didn't get overseas. It happened near the end of the war. So we weren't really a military family, and I think they were concerned, like everybody was, including myself, that you were going to Vietnam. You got drafted.
You understand?
So it was not a matter of in my generation, we knew we had an obligation. I mean, it's different now, but then you were going to either get out of the draft or get yourself drafted, one way or the other. And I ended up getting drafted.
Okay. What primary and secondary school or colleges did you attend, and did you probably went to college after you got drafted, I would think, but what about your primary and secondary schools prior to being drafted?
I started out in the New Cumberland, Pennsylvania school system, which became part of the West Shore School District. And so I went up through 9th grade in New Cumberland, 5th Street Elementary, 9th grade at the high school, which became the junior high because it was the second year of Cedar Cliff, the jointure, and I graduated from Cedar Cliff. Then I went to Penn State in September of '63 and was there for 4 years. And I had about 20 credits left when I got drafted.
Okay.
And so I went back after the service to Penn State Harrisburg and finished up and got a degree, a secondary teaching certificate, social studies, and I also went for a little over a year and picked up an additional major in American Studies.
Okay. What kind of jobs did you hold prior to entering the military?
I worked as a mail clerk at AMP. I mowed lawns independently. One of the best jobs ever in my life was I worked for the Borough of New Cumberland in the summers, and I got to drive dump trucks and sweep streets and pave streets.
Yeah.
And on Saturday nights, I was the guy that went around and had to fill all the smudge pots for all the road, for all the places where there were hazards in the road for the weekend, so that people wouldn't drive into a ditch that was open, and then somehow I'd go home and try to get myself completely clean after I was completely covered with soot to go out for a date with the young lady on Saturday evening. I thought it was a great job.
Sounds like it. Can you tell us a little bit about when you went into the military? What was that like? Basic training and so on.
Well, I wasn't real happy to be there, but I was sworn in at the New Cumberland Army Depot, where I learned to swim, and also where I played basketball on Saturday night or Friday nights in the gym with a couple of my buddies that lived down there. And when we were going to learn to swim lessons, they still had POWs down there, and I had friends that had, the Army Depot kids went to school with us, so there I was, and they would put us on a bus, and we went to Fort Dix, and I got down there, and there were mostly all kids from Harrisburg. I mean, I was a Lemoyne draft board, but it was guys from Harrisburg, and I would say 60–70% of the kids were draftees. And I was always a pretty good athlete, so I did pretty well on all the tests, and I eventually got to become the platoon guide, and then I was the soldier of the cycle for my company, and I almost made soldier of the cycle for the whole time down there. I came in third. I wasn't sure I answered the questions about what I thought about Vietnam the right way. So I was marksmanship, and I was maxing the PT tests and all that kind of stuff. And I inquired about going to Warrant Officer flight training. I was interested in doing that. And they said, well, wait till you go to AIT and talk to them there. And we didn't know where we were going to AIT. And I almost had a college degree, so I was hoping to be a clerk and get sent to Germany. And instead, I got orders for Fort Polk, Louisiana, Tigerland, infantry AIT. When I arrived at Fort Polk, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. And we flew down there and went back through the bayou to get to Fort Polk, and walked onto the post, and they had everything. The reception center lit up and checked us in, and then they put us in the barracks, and we tried to get some sleep, and then about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they woke us up, and we got to meet our company commander and the first sergeant, and then things started the next morning. And the first thing we did was march off to the post theater, and there was a colonel standing up there welcoming us to Fort Polk and telling us we were all going to be combat infantrymen. We'd be in Vietnam in 4 months. And that was an eye-opener for everybody. So on the second day, we're in formation, and these people came out to the formation, and they polled us and asked who wanted to think about going to OCS, or an NCO school they had at the time, in which you went to Fort Benning for 9 weeks, I think, and then you became an E5, or the top 10% of the class became an E6, and then you came back to Polk and did one cycle of AIT with the troops, and then went to Vietnam, and you were a squad leader when you got there. And generally, all the guys that did it were draftees, so then you were out of the Army. You were done with your 2-year obligation. Or the other opportunity was dog handler school, which was scout dogs, which meant walking point, and I liked dogs, but didn't want to do that. And then they asked about Warrant Officer flight training, and myself and one other guy put our hands up, and next day after that, we had to report to the company commander, and I went in, I saw him, and he asked me some questions, and the guy, he was a captain, graduate of the University of Alabama. He'd been in Vietnam 2.5 tours in the 101st Airborne as an infantry officer, and he was getting out of the Army. And he said, I'll give you whatever time you need to take the tests, and good luck. So, and fortunately for our company, with his guidance, we didn't pay one rock the whole time we were there. When we were doing night maneuvers, we got a chance to sleep. We were not hassled. And as a result, I think we probably had the lowest AWOL rate of any infantry AIT company in Tigerland. And there were a lot of people that didn't want to go to Vietnam. So AWOL was a problem. Anyway, I took the test. Physical I took, first time I ever had an EKG. the whole bit. And then the FAST test, which is a flight aptitude test. I'd never flown anything. I'd been in an airplane one time, and they had all these pictures of what flight instruments were in various different attitudes. And I was supposed to determine whether we were in a left bank, nose down, nose up, which I wasn't familiar with at all, but I interpreted these things by being in my seat, doing one of these numbers, and I passed all the stuff. And then at the end of the cycle, I graduated, and I had orders. I was guaranteed a slot in flight school, but I also left. I had an opportunity to either leave Fort Polk on my 30-day leave with orders for Fort Lewis and going to Vietnam, or just go home and wait to get my orders for flight school, or stay there as a casual. Well, I'm going home, so I went home, and about 5 days before I was supposed to go to Fort Lewis, to be in Fort Lewis, I hadn't gotten orders for flight schools yet. So I got on the telephone and I called 4th Army, and this is Private Tritt, where PFC Tritt, I was PFC. Where are my orders for flight school? And somehow I got a civilian woman, and she was willing to talk to PFC Tritt. And she said, well, hold on. And she got back to me and she said, your orders are here. They're coming in the mail. You should have them in a couple of days. I said, well, that's good, because I'm not going to Fort Lewis. And, at that time, it was an envelope about that thick with 200 copies of these orders. So they arrived, went up with my dad to Carlisle Barracks to buy 10 sets of fatigues, and left and was off for Fort Walters, Texas, to be a warrant officer aviator.
Wow, the story, yeah. Kind of the stars aligned for you in a way, didn't they?
Yeah, I was lucky. The other guy he didn't get in flight school. And most of the people that were in flight school that were not prior service were guys that enlisted for it. And the way that worked is you went to Fort Polk for basic training, and then you got on a bus after basic training, and you took a bus out to Mineral Wells, Texas, and then you were in Mineral Wells for 20 days, or 20 weeks, excuse me. And so you weren't getting any leave anytime soon. They had you.
What was your most vivid memory of your time at flight school? What's your worst, best memories?
Well, I took to it pretty well. If the first 4 weeks were square meals, Army stuff, pre-flight. But the way it worked, you started having academic training twice a day, morning and afternoon. And it was all mostly aerodynamics and that kind of thing related to flying. And some military development, but it was learning how to keep your room clean and set up the displays and all that kind of stuff that any military school has, keep everything hidden in your security locker, and then we started to fly, and the way it worked was you started out with an instructor pilot, and he had 3 students. So some weeks you flew in the morning and had academic classes in the afternoon, and then the next week you flew in the afternoon and had academic classes in the morning. And the one thing I remember when we were first starting, we'd go out to these stage fields, which were like an airfield that had 6 runways and 4 landing spots on each runway. And you would fly traffic. But first of all, we started out learning to hover. The first thing you had to do was learn how to hover. And the instructor pilot would go out with one student for a while, and the other two students sat in the shack at the field. And you would look out and you would watch these helicopters, and they'd be doing circles and whatever and all that, and all of a sudden it would come to a complete halt and go back down to the start again. And that's exactly when the instructor pilot took it back from the student.
What kind of aircraft were you flying at that point?
TH-55, which was a military version of the used 300,
Yeah.
and it was a two-place piston engine helicopter, bubble type.
Yeah.
Some guys flew H-13s, which was a military version of the Bell 47, which is the MASH helicopter. That was the MASH helicopter. And other guys flew Hiller H-23s, which was also a bubble type helicopter. And both of those helicopters, the 13 and the 23, were the original scout helicopters in Vietnam until the OH-6 Lotus U's came online. And that was in about 67. So those guys that were flying scouts in Vietnam were in those piston engine bubble things, which was something more interesting than I wanted to get involved in.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Were there any instructors that stand out in your mind?
First
Full
guy,
instructors?
the first guy I had for an instructor, well, first of all, we all had white walls and half an inch on top. And when we walked into the class for the first time and we saw the warrant officer and commissioned officer flight instructors, all had come back from Vietnam. Not one of them had a haircut that met military standards, including the major that was a flight commander. Now, I'm not talking about people that looked like they were living in San Francisco, but they definitely didn't look like us. So immediately we decided this is pretty cool. You know, I want to be like these guys.
Yeah, sure.
The first, other than just egregious non-military adaptation, the first eliminations took place when guys just couldn't learn to hover. And I mean, it's equivalent. The only thing I can really equate it to is it's like trying to hold a standard shift car with a clutch on a hill without using a brake. You know, you're just kind of, and you start out, they give you the pedals, which control the nose, so you get through that, and then they give you the cyclic, which controls the tip path plane of the rotor, and actually turns the rotor system sideways and up and down and back, and that causes the aircraft to nose up, nose down, left or right. And then the collective, which is pitch on all three of the blades. They had 3 blades. Later in the UAs there were 2 blades, but the pitch is adjusted with the collective. But the TH-55 had a reciprocating engine. So it had a twist grip manual throttle on the collective. And when you increased power, you had to increase throttle. When you increased pitch, you had to increase throttle. And when you put in left pedal, which was anti-torque pedal, that increased the pitch in the tail rotor, so you also had to increase throttle. And you had to decrease throttle when you did the reverse of any of those things. So you're now coordinating 5 controls, and every time something happens one way or another, you have to make an adjustment. And it was one of those things, I'm never going to get it, and all of a sudden, boom, you had it. And you'll never forget it. But, you know, oh my God, I can do this. And then we started flying traffic patterns, and then we did engine out, roll the throttle off, out of rotation, the landings. And after they were convinced that if you lost an engine on your first solo flight, you probably weren't going to kill yourself, the guy got out one day and he said, taken around the pattern a couple times. So you did 3 times around the pattern, and now you got solo wings that went on your little hat and dunked in the Holiday Inn pool on the way home.
There you go.
And I now solo. So, and I stayed with that. The way that it worked is that the first 8 weeks of flying was primary flight instruction, and it was basically just traffic pattern stuff and max performance takeoffs where you go straight up and then go fly. And we did, we didn't do anything other than really just fly around the traffic pattern. But we did fly sometimes out to the state field and back to the main heliport solo. And then in primary 2, we got different instructors. And then we started doing confined areas and slopes and pinnacles and night flight, and we did cross countries. We had our first fatality with one of the students on our first night flight. He was to fly back to the main heliport solo. He got disoriented. He went down to look for road sign, hit power lines. Guy lived 4 rooms up the hall from me, and he was gone, and they're taking all the stuff out. So, I mean, we all knew that was a possibility, but it was kind of a rude awakening when that happened.
Well, you did deploy to the combat zone. Want to tell me a little bit about how that happened and what year did you go? And
I graduated from flight school in June of '69, and I was home for 30 days. I left to go to Oakland Army Depot, and then we were going to go from Travis Air Force Base to Vietnam. And I left my parents at Middletown, and just was a very weird feeling the whole way flying all the way out to San Francisco. And then I got there, and they were all my flight school buddies, so now it's okay again. So now we're talking about where we're going to get. We all had orders for some unit in Vietnam, which meant absolutely nothing, because when we got there, they were sending you where they needed us. So I got there, and the first thing I did, this is wild, but the first thing I did was we were in Benoit, and where we landed, and we're in the waiting to go to the replacement depot, and I looked up at the transportation officer that's running this thing. He was a captain. And lo and behold, it was the big brother from my big brother from my fraternity at Penn State, and he's up there. So I go up. John Boniface is the name. How you doing, John? Whatever. And as it turned out, he got to help us. We got to help him out a little bit. He got to help us out a little bit because of that relationship. So that was a good deal. So then we went over to the 90th replacement and found out where we were going. And there were 3 guys from my flight school class, 2 guys and I, that got assigned to Bravo Company 227th Aviation and 1st Cavalry Division. So then we went to the 1st Team Academy, the FTA, which in those days meant something entirely different. Yeah. So for 3 days, they did all the in-country kind of stuff, demonstrations with Cobras, and then they put us on a Chinook and flew us from Benoit to Phu Minh, which is about 40 miles north of Saigon. That was 1st Cavalry Division headquarters. And we landed there, and the Jeep pulled up and it said anytime, anywhere, and they meant it, that kind of stuff. And they took us over to battalion headquarters, which was at Phu. The 227th was, 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 the 2 the history of the 1st Cavalry in Vietnam. The division was formed in 1921, and it had elements of the old 7th Cav, 5th Cav, the Buffalo Soldiers, and 9th Cav was in a 12th Cav. MacArthur's dad's cavalry, and from the Indian Wars, mostly. And it fought in the Pacific, in the Philippines in World War II, and it was the occupying division in Japan at the end of the war. And then it was in Korea. But Kennedy and McNamara decided that to fight these wars of national liberation that were happening in the early 60s, they needed a new kind of division. So they formed this division at Fort Benning called the 11th Air Assault Test Division. And they really, and McNamara pretty much gave them free rein to develop this division the best way they thought fit without a lot of red tape. So they were buying stuff off the shelf. They were setting up TO&Es where an aviation company in one lift could pick up an infantry company, an aviation battalion, an assault battalion in one lift. They figured out how they were going to form this division. And then after the test was complete and they said, we're going to be set up, there was a fight between the armored people and the airborne people in the Army, whether it was going to be the 101st or the 1st Cav. And the armored people won, so they took the 1st Cavalry colors from Korea and flew them to Benning, and took the 2nd Infantry colors at Benning, who were the guys that were the grunts in the 11th Air Assault Test, and flew their colors to Korea. So that's how the 2nd Infantry Division got to Korea and the Cav got to Vietnam. And as soon as the division was stood up, Lyndon Johnson ordered it to Vietnam. Yeah. And within 30 days of stand-up, the advanced party were going to Vietnam.
What kind of missions did you fly when you ended up with that unit?
Well, we were an assault helicopter company. In the way our battalion was formed, there were 3 lift companies, A Company, B Company, and C Company, had 20 UAs each. We flew a crew of 4, pilot, co-pilot, or in Vietnam was aircraft commander, pilot, crew chief, and gunner. And the crew chiefs and gunners both manned M60 machine guns in the back, and occasionally 50 calibers. We had a couple of aviation 50 calibers. The aircraft commander was in command of the aircraft regardless of who was in the back and who was up front. I flew as an aircraft commander as a W1 with lieutenant colonels. Not very often, but it happened once in a while, and that's the way it was set up. And the Air Force does the same thing. They'll have a captain as the captain of the B-52 and they'll have a colonel in the right seat. I mean, it just makes sense. There's a lot of things in aviation that make sense that don't make sense in other parts of the Army sometimes. So, anyway, so we basically flew, our basic mission was to do combat assaults with the infantry. And I was there in '69, so the Cav had been there 4 years, and they had a culture that was developed, and it was a well thought of division, and they knew how to do the mission. So the commission, the battalion commanders, and the captains, and the grunts knew how to handle helicopters. They knew what helicopters could do. They knew what we couldn't do. We knew what they had to do, so it was like a team working. It was great. The other missions we had were, not only assaults, but we did extractions, and sometimes we did extractions to assaults, and sometimes we just did final extractions. Every day each of our infantry battalions. There were 9 infantry battalions in the division. Each infantry battalion got a command and control UE for the S3 and the battalion commander. And they also got a logbook, which on the LZs, there was usually one of the infantry companies from the battalion manning the LZ, another infantry company right around the immediate perimeter out in the bush, a couple of artillery batteries. There might be some other elements, some recon people and signal people or whatever. Some of these LZs became pretty much permanent bases. Other ones were there for a couple of days and got moved. You know, so and we did all kinds of couriers, and we also flew command and control for like the engineer battalion, the signal battalion, and the engineer. When you got to be an aircraft commander, and it usually took about 3 to 4 months and about 300 hours, and you were taught by the guys that were 4 months ahead of you, because they became aircraft commanders. They were taught by the guys ahead of them, and there were instructor pilots in the battalion who oversaw that, working in conjunction basically with the operations officer and the company commander. There wasn't that much of a structure of platoon leaders. They were there administratively, but if it was a captain that was not an aircraft commander, he wasn't leading anything. You know, that's what it amounted to. So I became an AC in about 3.5 months, and basically, the first month you were there, you didn't know anything. So you were just kind of in awe. And the second month you were there, you were starting to figure stuff out. And you were starting to learn different stuff from the different people you flew with. And I tried to, and most of the people did, try to keep the stuff that they liked, that worked, and disregard some of the other stuff. And you also started to realize that there were some people you didn't like flying with. And by the third month, there were some people you wouldn't fly with. I'd get in with it. I was real happy to become an aircraft commander because I didn't have to get in with some of those guys. We had a problem with some people that I never felt I needed to show off in the helicopter. I thought I basically could make a UE do just about anything it would do, but I never made it do that unless I absolutely had to. Yeah. Because I was not interested. I mean, most of the people who got killed in helicopters in Vietnam wrecked them. It was not ground air.
Showing off.
Yeah, showing off, or just you were in a tough environment to fly in because of high density altitude. We didn't have any real weather information other than what we saw out the window. I mean, we never got a weather brief. You know, it was a dry season or wet season. The wet season, it was going to pour sometime during the day. It didn't rain continually. There was a monsoon sometime during the day, so you just avoided it. Dry season, every time you landed, you were in danger of having a brownout from the dust. And when you were flying during the day, visibility would be down to about a mile in haze and smoke because the jungle was always on fire. From artillery, from whatever. You'd be flying along 2,500 feet, you smell the mahogany burning on the ground.
Bill, how much did your combat experience change you as a person?
Well, I got a lot of confidence in myself because I could do it, and I was good at it. And the flying. Everybody, me included, was scared all the time. It was always there was a term when something bad happened. One of the big Vietnam terms was, there it is, you know, and it was when the fear manifested itself and you saw it. So you lived with that all the time. That the one thing that we all learned is the first thing you had to do in a critical situation was fly the aircraft. Fly the airplane. If you don't fly the airplane, you're not getting out of this, you know. So it didn't do you any good to panic. So you became almost supernaturally calm while you were doing this. I've been trained to do this.
Almost robotic?
Trained. You're reacting to training.
Yeah.
You're reacting to training. And then, after it was done, that's how you got PTSD. That's what happened. And I'm still in touch with the guys that I flew with, that were my friends, you know. And if I get a call from one of them at 3 o'clock in the morning, I answer, you know. And we all have a little touch PTSD. I mean, the first cab lifts the pilots. We were in the midst of it. But you know, I had one bad year in '75. I think it was a combination of some personal stuff that was going on with me, but it was also when the war was over, and you know, you put everything into it. I mean, we damn well knew that as soon as we left, it was going to end. I mean, we all knew that, you know.
Did you do anything for good luck when you were there? I heard, I've talked to many pilots, and some have, a lot of them actually have said they did something, some little thing maybe. They carried something, it was a special coin or whatever. You know?
I had a scapula. You know what a scapula is? Yeah. That a girl that I was in love with in college gave me one time, and I kept it in my wallet the whole time I was there.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. It must have worked. You're here.
Yeah. No, yeah.
How did you get into the 28th Division?
When I came home from Vietnam, I was getting all this stuff in the mail about going to getting in the Guard, join the Guard. And the unit that I eventually joined was at Capital City Airport in New Cumberland. And I was back home in my parents' house. So I went down to the airport one day, and I went in there and I saw this lieutenant, I guess he was, maybe Captain, Luke Shade, who was well known in the aviation brigade and worked in flight operations over there, whatever. And I said, I'm CW2 Bill Trill, and here, you know, I've got 1,600 hours of combat flight time. He said, well, we got Hueys, now we got Hueys. And he said, I think I can get you a second lieutenant's position in the Transportation Corps if you're willing to go down to Fort Eustis for the basic officers course. And I said, I left Vietnam 2 weeks ago. My company commander offered me a first lieutenant with time and grade. I would have been a captain in 6 months, or a RA warrant, or just stay here until you're done. You know, I actually was getting a month's drop, you know, and I didn't have to take it. And I said, I'm not going to Fort Eustis. I'm not going to be a second lieutenant. So 6 years later, I started to, on the advice of somebody that told me, you know, you start flying again, I joined the Guard and got in the unit down in Reading, which was 8 Company, 28th Aviation Battalion. Mm-hmm. And flying Hueys, they assigned me to gunships. I said, I'm not flying. We had actually Mike models on us. I'm not flying. I didn't fly gunships in Vietnam. I don't want to fly gunships. Well, all troops. So that's what I did.
Yeah. That's great. Did you take advantage of any more schooling after you came back? GI Bill, benefits or anything?
First of all, I went to Capitol to get my degree, Penn State Harrisburg to get my degree. I used a GI Bill for that. I also used a GI Bill to get a fixed wing commercial pilot's license, single engine airplane commercial and instrument license. I took 30 days of active duty here at Indiantown Gap to get a standard instrument ticket. We were issued tactical instrument tickets before we went to Vietnam. We only did 2 real approaches, ground controlled and ADF approaches, because that's all they had in Vietnam. So for us to get standard instrument tickets in the States, we had to do ILSs and VORs and all that stuff. So that's what we did here for a month. And then through self-study and I got myself an airline transport pilot helicopter license, and also a certified flight instructor license, rotorcraft, helicopter, and certified flight instructor instruments. So I did that through my own self-study. So I've got like 6 typewritings on the ATP.
And you worked in a civilian sector, aviation?
Yeah, I went to work for a small coal company up in Clearfield, flying a used 300, the same thing I learned then. They sold the helicopter. I went to work for Johnstown Coal and Coke, and then they wanted to get rid of the helicopter too. So I'd been taking it down to Somerset, Pennsylvania, to Special Jet Services. And Special Jet Services was owned by PBS Coals, which was a major coal operator in western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Maryland. And the guy that owned PBS Coals was a Penn State grad, about 35 years old, and he also was a Learjet captain and owned corporate jets and Special Jet Services. So they had 2 helicopters, and the job opening was on one of them. I went, interviewed him. We knew some people in common. He asked me he answered the two questions that I had the right way, and my 2 questions were, who decides to fly? And he said, you do. I said, good, that's the right answer. And who's in charge of the maintenance? You are. Good, that's the right answer. And it didn't matter what he was offering me. If I didn't have those 2 qualifications, I wasn't taking the job. Yeah. You know? And it was great, because the guy used to sit in the back of the helicopter and just let me fly. And I'd do instrument approaches. We had single pilot IFR helicopters. He'd be sitting there and I'd be flying into Richmond. We'd be going from Somerset to Richmond, and it's weather, and we're landing, and I'm flying this approach, and we get on the ground. The only thing, nice approach, Bill.
Well, you obviously had confidence in you.
Yeah, it was great.
Bill, how did your military service, your experiences affect your life, do you think?
Well, first of all, I was completely undisciplined before I got in the military. You know, and I learned how to hurry up and wait. I'll give you an example. When I went back to, I had about a 2-1 or something when I left Penn State. So when I went back to Capitol, I didn't have a grade point average, so they started me all over again. So I was living in a house with a couple other guys that were law students at Dickinson in Camp Hill while I was going to Capitol. So I drove down there in the morning. I went in and went to my classes. I went and sat in the lounge. I did all my homework, copied all my notes. I went home, and then I could go out and play at night, you know. And I never could figure out, I just treated it like a real job. And I had enough self-discipline to do that, so I ended up graduating with a 3.7.
There you go. What are some of the life lessons you learned from your military service that you might want to impart on young people coming up now?
How about repeating that twice?
What are some of the life lessons you learned from your military service that you might want to share or impart upon young people coming up now?
The important thing is, if you're going to do something, the thing you want to do is do your best at it, and if you fail, that's all right. But if you don't try, that's not all right. Yeah. And you will find that I have found that 90% of the time, even the things that I'm leery of and not sure of, that if I put the effort in, I become successful at it, and then that makes me happy. But the biggest sin is failure to try, and you tell that to all kids. I coached tennis for 25 years, and my two adages. The thing is, when you're coaching tennis, you got to do two things. You got to teach them how to hit the ball, and then you got to teach them how to win. And they're two entirely different things. If you have a great forehand, it's like a 9.9 out of 10, but the ball doesn't land on the court, you lose. So my two adages were: you have to play in the present. You can't worry about the shot you just missed, or you can't think about what's going to happen if you make the shot you're hitting. So just the only ball that matters is the one that's coming at you. Yeah. And the other thing is, don't you dare look at the finish line until you're on the other side of it, looking back at it.
Yeah, those are good points. What was one more question for you? What was the one question you wish I would have asked you?
Actually, maybe a little more about my unit.
In Vietnam or
in Vietnam.
Guard?
Yeah.
Feel free.
Well, we had the distinction of being the first assault helicopter company in the history of the Army, Bravo 227. Mm-hmm. And our motto was the good deal company. The good deal meaning, have I got a good deal for you, buddy? Which meant, oh shit. But we took pride in it, and it was, number one, the best educational environment I was ever in. Somebody's teaching me how to do this, I'm teaching somebody else. It's getting passed down. And it came from the guys that were doing it down in Benny, and then the guys that really learned how it was supposed to work in the Drang, because I had a company commander that was in the Drang. He was a 27-year-old major in his third tour. The guy could fly, and we'd sit around the club and he'd talk about those days and how things were formed and all that kind of stuff. So the tradition, and there's a lot of people who are in the 1st Cavalry Division. I don't know anybody that's not proud of being in it. So that's my deal. A little more about the cab, and but.
Well, whatever you'd like to talk about, feel free. But
well,
that's a good point.
And the other thing is, I had two roommates, and actually they both went to the same high school, but neither of them knew they were Army aviators until they ran into each other. And one guy was 2 weeks ahead of me, and he actually extended for 6 months when I extended for 6 months. So both of us were there for 17 months, as it turned out for me. They were both drafted, and I was drafted. So there were a lot of us that were drafted. And I mean, I did 37 years. And the other guy who was in the Oregon Guard, who's now lives in Florida, and he's an attorney, he did 37 years too. And in Vietnam, all we wanted to do was get out of the army.
Just wanted to survive, right?
I wanted to survive, wanted to get out. There was no idea of a military. And, you know, I was with them last summer at the reunion, and he and I looked at each other, how in hell did we ever do this? Many years, you know. So, you know, the camaraderie that goes, and I had a crew chief who's been an attorney in Janesville, Wisconsin for years, one of my best friends that I'll ever meet. I mean, you know, the guy hung out with us. There was very little, the flight crews were flight crews. Rank didn't matter. Half the time, if we were staying somewhere overnight, everybody was a W1. This guy's a W1. He's a Spec 4. No, he's a W1. Yeah, he's staying with us. Yeah. So, and the Army, that's the whole warrant officer aviator thing is kind of legendary for a number of reasons in the Army. And I'm just proud I was one of them.
Yeah. Well, listen, we are proud that you were able to take some time and happy that you took the time to sit and tell us a little bit about your story, and we greatly appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah.